to Drum Talk, and today we're going to talk about a drummer who played with Elvis Presley and Neil Diamond. His name is Ron Tutt. And the reason I'm talking about Ron Tutt is I did a drum cover of Suspicious Minds, which is an Elvis Presley song from back in the 60s. And Ron Tutt is the original drummer on the song, but I'll never forget watching Ron Tutt play with Elvis on television as a kid, with his big, massive blue sparkle Ludwig kit with concert toms over here, double-headed toms that had the bottoms off over here, floor toms over here, cymbals, and just whipping around the kit. So when I did Suspicious Minds, I had that in my mind, Ron Tutt. But Ron Tutt has played on a lot of albums, a lot of records, and he's a pretty famous drummer. And matter of fact, I have a connection to Ron Tutt through my wife, Stephanie. Stephanie Bennett actually interviewed Ron Tutt for Modern Drummer magazine in the July 1988 issue of Modern Drummer. And in this particular issue, she talked to him. I think it's his only in-print interview that I can find. He may be in Classic Drummer or something somewhere, but I have not been able to find any other interviews with Ron Tutt. But my wife interviewed Ron Tutt and asked him a lot of pertinent questions about his time with Elvis. Ron was just starting to work with Neil Diamond, replacing Hal Blaine in Neil Diamond's band, by the way. Hal Blaine, who made the big concert tom kit famous. He also played in the Jerry Garcia band that toured out. And he went out with Jerry Garcia band for years. And today he tours with the Elvis band that goes out and does concerts with Elvis footage and plays the backing tracks in live sync to Elvis. So that's pretty cool. Him and Paul Liem share that chair. And anybody who knows anything about me knows that Paul Liem is somebody I've mentioned before on some of my videos. So the big concert tom, Fiberglass concert tom kit inspired me to want to do a little bit of a drum talk on Ron Tutt. Now, a couple other things about Ron Tutt. I don't know, a lot of people don't know this, but he played with Billy Joel. Songs in the Attic has Ron Tutt playing drums on it. And one of the famous songs from Songs in the Attic is a song called Captain Jack. And I did a drum cover of Captain Jack way back about 6-9 months ago. And that was not Liberty DeVito. There is a live version of it with Liberty on it. There's a live album that Liberty played on. But the one that Ron Tutt played on, he played on the original album. And the original album version of Captain Jack, among other songs there. So Ron's been on a lot of stuff. Ron's an amazing drummer. His background comes from Dallas, Texas. He started out playing in the studios in Dallas, and Dallas, Texas was a jingle studio town. They did jingles in New York and Los Angeles, but not as much as they did them in Chicago and Dallas, okay? And he worked in Dallas, Texas, and he was doing jingles, and he did a lot of the radio ads. And back in the 70s, the big radio ads would be something like 99.X, that kind of thing. There'd be these kind of radio IDs, and they had all these concert toms on it. And Ron Tutt did a lot of those. So did Paul Liem, by the way. Paul Liem was actually referenced making these radio IDs. But I know they were doing a lot of that kind of playing in Dallas, Texas. But in Dallas, Texas, he met a guy named Larry Londin, who was the keyboard player for Elvis. And Larry went on to go out with Elvis after the 1969 comeback. And that's when Elvis put a new band together. And Jerry Scheff was the bass player in the band. Now, Jerry Scheff is Jason Scheff's dad. Jason Scheff is the bass player, or was the bass player for Chicago for many years after Pete Cetera left. So Jerry Scheff was in Elvis's band. And I forget the guitar player's name. He's another famous guy. But that rhythm section went on to play with Elvis in Las Vegas for runs in Las Vegas and all over the world. And anyhow, I just wanted to do a little shout-out video about Ron Tutt and say that he's a huge influence on my playing because he's got a live energy thing. That's what I remember Ron Tutt from, is the live energy. And if you can go back into YouTube and look at some of the old live Elvis footage from the 70s, where he's playing the shows in Vegas, you'll find Suspicious Minds. It's a little bit faster than the album version, but it's got that energy. And what I was going for when I did that cover was I was going for that energy and all those fills. Because what Elvis used to say to Ron Tutt was, if I'm doing karate moves, you got to catch my karate kicks. Now, Ron Tutt didn't say that in this article, okay? But I know that Ron Tutt had to follow that. He mentioned the following Elvis's moves thing in the article to my wife. But there was another drummer that played with Elvis when Ronnie couldn't play, a guy named Larrie Londin, who's another guy that you guys should look up and get to know his work. Larrie Londin was a huge session drummer in Nashville. He started out playing some sessions on Motown stuff by accident because Benny Benjamin got sick or something. He ended up playing on some Motown stuff. He was traveling with a band through Detroit. He lived in Detroit and then found his way to Nashville and then became one of the most famous country drummers of the 70s and 80s until he passed away in 1992, a few months before Jeff Porcaro passed away. And Larrie Londin was a big guy. He had a heart issue, and that's what took him out. But Larrie Londin, when he played with Elvis, he had a big Pearl Fiberglass concert tom kit. That was one of the things he had. And he talks about, in an article in Modern Drummer Magazine, I think it was his first article in Modern Drummer Magazine, playing with Elvis, and Elvis saying to him, you got to catch all my kicks. Like, when I do a karate kick, here, you got to go hit a crash cymbal, hit it there, and come around the kit and catch everything. That was kind of Elvis's show. And Larrie Londin had to pick that up. So I know Ron Tutt was the guy that invented it because he talks about how he got the audition with Elvis, and the reason Elvis took him was that he was focused on Elvis. There was another guy that was a really more famous player in there in the audition, but it was him connecting with Elvis and watching Elvis. And back in the day of playing music with anybody new, I always really tried to scope the leader of the band. I said worship leader. I play a lot of church stuff. But whatever band I'm playing with, you want to scope the leader who's leading the songs and make sure you stay with them, because that's the key to the whole thing. Keeping that gig is being able to follow people. It's having big ears and then being able to follow. And apparently Ron Tutt had that in spades. He could do it. Right around 1988 was when he took the gig from Hal Blaine from the Neil Diamond gig. Hal Blaine was just retiring at that point, didn't want to tour anymore, and I think Ronnie came in and started doing Neil Diamond pretty hot and heavy. Neil had a famous drummer in the 70s named Dennis St. John who had another big concert tom kit. I'll never forget seeing that kit. Because again, Neil Diamond comes out of the Elvis school. It was big shows, lots of flashy clothes. If you were to see Neil Diamond in the 70s, you would see all the kind of rhinestone stuff going on. It wasn't a country thing. It was like that pop rock thing of the 60s and early 70s. And these guys that came in the 60s, and Neil Diamond was a guy that wrote a lot of songs in the 60s for people, made his name through the 70s and into the 80s. Don't get me wrong. But Neil Diamond had that Elvis persona kind of thing going on. And anyhow, he had a drummer named Dennis St. John who had played Slingerland, and he had a whole big concert tom kit when I saw him. And he was doing a concert at the Greek Theater. And actually, Neil Diamond at the Greek Theater is an album I had as a kid. I used to play drums to as a kid. You know, there was a lot of things. There was, of course, the classic stuff, you know, that everybody sings along to today, you know. But there were some other songs on there. And Dennis St. John was a really good drummer, but apparently there was a falling out at some point. Then Hal Blaine came in for a short season, and then Ron Tutt. And Ron Tutt had the gig till the end, until now Neil's retired due to illness and stuff. So anyhow, all that to say is this concert tom kit this week has inspired a few covers. And one of them was Suspicious Minds. And the reason I pulled Suspicious Minds out was I found it on YouTube drum lists, and I ran it into my Logic, and I took it out. But then I tried to play it on my small kit. I had a 4-piece kit up, and it didn't work. I just said, I can't lock into this. But the day I put this kit up and I set my microphones up, and by the way, my mic setup on this kit right now is a kick, a snare mic, got a D112E on the kick, Sennheiser 421 MD, I think it's a U5 mic or U2 mic, I forget what they call it. It was one of the earlier versions of the MD 421 on the snare. And over top, over here at a camera sight, is a 4033 Audio-Technica right over the kit. And over here I've got a blue baby bottle mic, and I've got equidistance to the snare, and basically that's my stereo image of the kit. So I'm recording these drums with 4 mics, and they cut through pretty good. I mean, I'd love to stick a mic in each tom, and that gets you that thunderous tom thing. But back in the 60s, they did not put, you didn't have a mic on every drum. A lot of times they were recorded with 2 mics overhead or 1 mic overhead. Like a lot of times you see pictures of Hal Blaine on the Monster kit. He's got a mic right here in the dead center, picking up the whole kit. Maybe one on the kick drum. So they used a real minimal mic setup back in those days when these kits started being used all the time in the studios. So anyhow, that Suspicious Minds, I had the track, I pulled it out, and I played 1 pass of it. And I said, that kind of was not too bad for 1 pass. I kind of had this one little section where it switches to 12/8, or the 6/8 section. And I basically did a second pass. I did 4 takes of it. The 4th take's the one the 3rd take's the one we used. So, and all 4 takes were good. I actually have an alternate take that I may release someday, different fills, of course. But the inspiration of the fills was Ron Tutt. Watching Ron Tutt play live and having all that stuff, that jazz he puts on it. So Ron Tutt's a guy you want to look up, and you want to look at his resume. Now he played in L.A. He was an L.A. drummer for years too. He did a lot of sessions in L.A. Other guys I mentioned in this edition of Drum Talk that are connected to Elvis in different ways. One, of course, Hal Blaine played on the Comeback Special, 1968 Comeback Special, 69 Comeback Special, that was on NBC television. It was a big night. Matter of fact, I have another story about that too. One of the guitar players on the Comeback Special is a guy named Mike Dacey. And when I was reading this issue of the Modern Drummer magazine, Mike Dacey actually was in a band with Ron Tutt. Ron Tutt, it's interesting. Now, you have to understand, let me give you a little background about my wife writing for Modern Drummer magazine. My wife wrote the first contemporary Christian drummers article for Modern Drummer magazine. She did a 6 drummer interviews for contemporary Christian drummers, CCM Music. CCM Music was not big yet, not as big as it is today, that's for sure. Christian radio was on AM a lot of times. It was kind of a fledgling industry coming up into the 80s. Then a little girl named Amy Grant, who's my age now, she got some hits, and then she got some crossover value, and all of a sudden CCM was on the rise. But Ron Tutt had an experience with Christ, and my wife caught that connection, and she brought that up in the article. And he talks about his conversion to Christ, and it was right around the Dylan period. Dylan was 1980, so he had a conversion to Christ somewhere in the road after Elvis passed, I guess. They never got into the when it happened thing. But the interesting part of the story is he mentions this band called the Sanctified Boogie Band. And there's a guitar player in the band named Mike Dacey. Well, in 1992, Mike Dacey would come to be one of the associate pastors at a church I was at. And I would do some touring with Mike Dacey. I would play some music with Mike Dacey. So I spent a lot of time with Mike Dacey, let's put it that way. And got to know him and did some concerts. And matter of fact, the Sanctified Boogie Band was going into high schools and doing a real positive message kind of concerts in the high schools. And that's what I went out and toured with Mike Dacey doing. In West Virginia, Kentucky, New York State, upstate New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey. I did a whole bunch of those concerts with him and a small group, a bass player, and it's usually me, him, and a bass player. It was a trio gig, and we would play songs, some Elvis tunes too. But Mike Dacey was the guitar player on the Comeback Show. He was one of the guitar players that's playing on stage on that Elvis Comeback Show. So really interesting stuff that I've got some connections to this whole thing through guys like Mike Dacey, and my wife interviewing Ron Tutt. But it's just an interesting world. So that music's in my blood. So what came out on that cover was just in my blood to play. I mean, it's the kind of music I grew up on. My dad was a 50s person. He loved Elvis. So we always had 50s music playing around the house, and I always knew when it was Elvis. Steph's dad loved the song My Way, which Frank Sinatra made famous, but also Elvis did a version of it too at one point, I think. I'm pretty sure he did. Yeah, it's just kind of a interesting connections of all these different things. But one last thing before I go. Elvis had another drummer. His name was DJ Fontana. And DJ Fontana is featured in a book called The Big Beat. Now, this book is out of print for a long time. This was written by Max Weinberg. And a lot of guys ask me, where do you get your drum knowledge from? Well, I've got 40 years of Modern Drummer magazine in this studio. But the other place I get a lot of my knowledge from is some of the books I've read. This is a classic book called The Big Beat. And this book features Hal Blaine's in it, Dino Danelli of the Rascals, DJ Fontana from Elvis, Russ Kunkel, Ringo Starr, Charlie Watts, Dave Clark of the Dave Clark Five, Kenny Jones from The Who and Faces, Earl Palmer, Bernard Purdy, Roger Hawkins, who is the fatback drummer from Muscle Shoals, Alabama, Jim Keltner and Levon Helm, and one other drummer, a guy named Johnny B, who was a Detroit drummer, I believe. And he's the guy on the cover, believe it or not, is Johnny B. And Max Weinberg with Robert Santinelli wrote this book, The Big Beat, back in the 80s. And I picked this up at a used bookstore for, I think, like $5 or something. It was $10 new, okay? I'm telling you, this has got some classic stories in it. And this is probably the top drum book I would tell you to pick up of drummers. If you want to read like some they're not autobiographical, but it's biography type drumming interviews with drummers would be Max's book. Great book, awesome book. Anyhow, that's it for Drum Talk. Thank you for watching. I appreciate you guys spending time with me. Have a great day.